What's up, guys? Daniel Elias Fishing here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk a little bit about treble hooks, specifically round bend trebles versus EWG trebles, when to use each one, and why. But first of all, hey, I appreciate you guys tuning in like always. Hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, leave me a comment, let me know your thoughts, because to be honest, not everyone agrees on when you should throw each style, so I'm going to share my opinion for what I do, and then you guys might have a difference of opinion, and that's okay. You can leave it in the comments below. We can discuss it a little bit. But really, let me get into the two different types of trebles. First, most commonly, what you guys are used to seeing would be what's called a round bend treble, like this one, okay? And it's a round bend treble where you can see the bend on that hook is round, right? It comes around, it's perfectly rounded, kind of comes up, turns, and it's pointed 180 degrees towards that line tie, right? I'm trying to get it to where you can see it. This is what you see most commonly on bait straight out of the package. So you go to Bass Pro Shops, you buy a new crankbait, right? Maybe you get a dredger or a money badger or something, and it comes with round bend trebles. Really, really good hooks. And they're Fusion 19s, they're awesome, they're sharp. The other style is what's called an EWG treble. Now, you can see on that EWG treble, the hook points are turned in towards the line tie, right? So you have this totally different angle where the hook point is pointed not 90 degrees and straight up, but actually in a little bit. So, couple of big differences between the two style hooks, right? Number one, what I would tell you is if you have fish that are slapping at a bait, right? So, in essence, maybe you're throwing a crankbait or you're throwing a topwater and the fish are not really committing, they're coming up and they're slapping at it, you're far more likely to hook that fish on a round bend with those hook points turned out than an EWG with the hook points that are turned in. And that's just because there's a bigger gap. They shoot out a little bit more. You have just a little more opportunity to get that hook into a fish. That being said, if you hook two fish, one on a round bend, one on an EWG, you are less likely to lose that fish on an EWG simply because the point is turned in and it really helps keep fish pegged, okay? So when do you want to throw each one? And this is where it can get a little bit tricky, right? We know if fish are slapping at the bait, the round bend's going to be better at hooking them. But if you do hook one, the EWG is better at keeping them on. So I'm going to talk about really kind of what you're fishing first. So if you get around grass, I would always tell you that the EWG tends to perform a little bit better in terms of shedding grass off and not really getting as much grass on it. But also getting it off, I really prefer the EWG hooks. If you're just fishing rock, there's not a whole lot of difference, on a crankbait, let's say. In terms of you getting hung up, there's not going to be a huge difference using one versus the other. What I would say is if you've got fish that are pretty committed and they're biting the baits, I really like an EWG hook in terms of making sure your fish stay pegged and you keep them on and you can land them. But there are certain styles of baits that I don't prefer that on. So actually, one I'm going to talk about real quick is when you're throwing a topwater. So let's think of a topwater walking bait, like a jaywalker. Fish, when they're feeding up on the surface, they don't always get the best look at the bait. It's moving, it's darting side to side, something like that. That's, you're walking the dog and they're trying to really get on there and get on that bait. And you see that a lot with topwaters where you're like, oh, I missed them, right? And sometimes they come back. I really prefer a round bend in that scenario because you're just more likely to hook a fish when you know it's a bait that doesn't always hook up immediately. Sometimes a fish got to hit it 2 times or 3 times even. Sometimes they get it right away. But on topwaters, I almost always throw a round bend. I really like EWGs on crankbaits specifically, just because a lot of times when I'm throwing a crankbait, I try to get the color matched to what fish are feeding on and get a really good solid bite. But especially on those larger crankbaits, when a fish comes up and they jump, they have a lot of leverage with a heavy bait, and it makes it easier for them to throw that bait. So I really like an EWG treble when I can get away with it. Now there's times where it's not always best, so if you've got a really, really wide-bodied crankbait, an EWG sometimes doesn't have enough gap to really get those fish sunk in. But most crankbaits in EWG works fine. So that's really what I prefer. Now when I get down to the smaller crankbaits and I'm using little bitty hooks, sometimes those little bitty EWGs, and we're talking about size 6s or 8s, right, or even smaller, don't really have a ton of gap on some baits that are a little bit thicker. So when I get into smaller crankbaits, I almost always throw round bends. The exception to small treble hooks where I use EWGs is going to be on jerkbaits. So you got to remember, jerkbait's a very, very thin bait, right? So there's nothing in that body that generally gets in the way of a treble hook, which is pretty awesome when you look at the Berkley Stunna line. The Stunnas come with EWG trebles already on them. I wish they did that with more baits, but the reality is they go with whatever's easiest generally and what most people are looking for, and most people are comfortable with a round bend. But I keep a stock of all of them. What I would tell you is none of this matters. So nothing what I'm saying matters if your hooks are not sharp. So I don't care what style of hook you throw. If that thing is not sharp, it doesn't make a difference, right? The most important thing you have to remember is you need sharp hooks. Not all baits come with good hooks. As a matter of fact, most baits come with very, I would say the hooks would be mediocre at best. So they're not very sharp out of the package. They dull really quickly. What you really want is a hook that is razor sharp, but also stays sharp. So if you're bumping into rocks and trees, it's so easy to roll a hook point where the point right at the tip will turn in or turn out or whatever way it turns, it'll roll. And you'll feel that sometimes when you run your finger over a point, all of a sudden you feel something catching because the hook point's rolled out or rolled in. So what I would say is check your treble hooks, replace them even on new baits, unless your bait comes with premium hooks already. So the nice thing, like the Berkley hard baits, all come with these Fusion 19 trebles. And I gotta tell you, I love them. These are my favorite treble hooks ever made are Fusion 19s because, really, a couple of reasons. Number one, they're sticky sharp. Number two, they stay sharp. They are very, very resistant to rolling hook points, and they don't dull very easily. And lastly, because they're very strong. So it's a very strong hook with a very thin diameter, and that's what you want, because the thinner the diameter on that hook, the easier it can penetrate. Now, there becomes a trade-off, because if your hook is so thin that it bends out, it'll bend out and you'll lose fish, particularly big ones. So that's one of the reasons why I like the Fusion 19. They're thin, but they are incredibly strong. It's extremely difficult to bend them out, and they stay sharp. So give them a shot. I'm going to link both the round bends and the EWG trebles down in the description. They even make feathered models for your topwaters on the back hook. So I'll link those as well down in the description. So if you're going to purchase them, go to that Berkley website. Use the link I provided. It helps me, helps my channel. But like always, guys, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you subscribing and liking. I assure you, my knee is almost there. I'm going to be back out on the water giving you some pretty cool content shortly. But for the meantime, we're going to enjoy some of this stuff at home. And hopefully I taught you something that you didn't know. I'll see you on the next one.